Hey everyone, and welcome back to Across the Gridiron. I am Matt, and I am once again, as always, joined by the man who is so excited for the start of the 2025 season that he told me in confidence that if the Cowboys even have a winning record this season, he is going to get Jerry Jones tattooed across his chest. Eddie, my friend, how are you? It's been a couple of weeks.
It has been a couple of weeks, so we took a well-deserved break, for the off season, so that we are ready to go for the season. And listen, there are a lot of things that I would want tattooed on my body, and Jerry Jones isn't one of them. I can tell you that for free. Listen, Jerry Jones is not the Cowboys' most favorite person right now, so. But I think there's a method to his madness, which is crazy. Um,
He's certainly my favourite person at the moment, purely because of what he's doing to you, Eddie. Purely because of what he's doing to you.
But guys, listen, we're glad to be back. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. And we appreciate all of you that keep coming back and watching the channel. So we can't do this without you.
Absolutely, absolutely. But look, the wait is almost over, Eddie. We are here. You can feel it. The season is almost starting. Preseason is done. Next step is obviously getting the rosters confirmed. So I'm sure there'll be plenty more stories to come out in the next week or so, which of course
True.
we will always be here to cover. But today, what we're going to do is we're just going to have a quick review on the preseason that was. We're going to do a bit of a debrief, see what we've learnt. We'll then look at some of the rookies who have really sort of stood out. Again, we might give them a little sort of scoring card on some of the rookies, and then we'll sort of end up with some of the bigger stories that's happened in football over the past last week or two. So that'll be our show this week. So Eddie, look, let's just kick straight off and get into it.
I'm the bad guy. I'm the, I'm the, I'm the
Let's look at the preseason. It's in the books. What are really some of the things that really sort of stood out for you? I mean, we'll cover the rookies in more detail in part two, but we could look at, are there any teams sort of surprising you? Any teams not doing as well as they thought they would do? What's some of the things that really sort of stood out for you in this preseason?
Um, I think one of the things that stood out for me is that teams took this preseason a little bit seriously, right? There were a lot of teams that had their starters, out there more than I expected. The Bengals was another one of them. Burrow played quite a bit in the preseason, as well. And that was refreshing to see, because typically this preseason games, you don't get to see a lot of starters. It's all about, filling the depth chart and who's going to, make it to the roster and getting a chance to see rookies and things like that. So that was interesting. I mean, there were some rookies that didn't get a lot of game time, which I thought was a little bit strange because this is the whole point, right? Their first entrance into the NFL. Preseason should be an opportunity for you to like, see a lot of them. But I think maybe teams are worried about injuries, to some of their star rookies that they've drafted. So I thought that was a little bit disappointing. Um, I don't always know what to make of the preseason games, right? Because you see some, outlandish scores. I mean, traditionally, Patriots, you never look at their preseason games because they were always used to be woeful, in the Tom Brady era. And, Bill Belichick always used to say that, well, he takes the first week of the game of the NFL as still part of the preseason. So you don't
Mhm.
actually judge, what they do in those games. But it was interesting to see, some teams, look like themselves. Some teams didn't look like themselves. The Lions didn't look like themselves. And I know there were a lot of, backups and the rest that played in those games. But They didn't look like themselves. The Eagles always look like themselves, which is quite annoying, right? They were rolling out backups and they were looking decent. They were making touchdowns and stuff like that. I was just like, can't this team just look bad? Even in preseason, just don't look good. Just show us that maybe you're taking a step back, in preseason, but it didn't seem like that. So, I mean, look at the Ravens. I think the Ravens went undefeated in preseason as well, 3-0, perfect record. That's kind of what you want. Broncos as well, I think they went 3-0 in the preseason. I mean, what does that really tell you? I mean, it could give you confidence about coaching. It could mean that, they've found a system that is working, that allows them to put points on the board and also allows them to be defensively sound no matter who, plays. And maybe you start to see the teams that are very systematic in what they do, right? They can plug and play players and they've got a system that is proven to work. So the preseason tells you that. And then you get a couple of players that pop, in the preseason, and there were a few of them. I know we're going to talk about, some of them. So for me, the preseason, it was like, welcome back to the NFL. It gets the juices racing. And then, of course, they're trying out new stuff, the now virtual, drawing of the line, which
Mhm.
which I'm not quite sure what I make of it, right? Saw it a few times in the preseason. I thought, I don't know. I kind of like the chains, thing, them dragging those chains like
Mhm.
like back in the 16th century, with people wearing those iron, suits and stuff like that. It kind of feels like that, a little bit medieval, sort of thing with the NFL. So I don't know if I don't know how I feel, but again, like a lot of things, you get used to it. So I think in all, it was a good preseason, amount of games. Of course, you want to see more. I want to see more. I want to see more of the big players playing. But you know, it just tells you that there are teams that are raring to go, and some teams, let's not talk about that team that is that has a star on their helmet. They don't know what they're doing. It seems like at this point.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll enter Cowboys corner at some point in this podcast. It is almost inevitable. But I do actually give you credit for not mentioning the Cowboys for the first 5 minutes. So this
I
is probably the
know, I
longest
know.
longest we've been.
It was hard.
Hey, it's you gotta do what you gotta do. I mean, it's interesting. You mentioned the scores don't matter, and a lot of guys. I mean, even the last final day of preseason, for instance, some mad scores. I can't see, for example, the Texans beating the Lions 26-7 in a regular season game. You know, what was the other one that stood out to me? Oh, yeah, the Colts beating the Bengals 41-14. I mean, yeah, I mean, there are certain things. I mean, obviously, we'll talk about it more later, but the Colts certainly celebrating the dropping of Richardson there
Yeah.
in grand style there. I mean, obviously, one of the bit of news, obviously, preseason always brings up injuries. What we've seen is the Raiders lost Aiden O'Connell with a fractured wrist in preseason. Obviously,
Yes.
he's just a backup there. But again,
Yeah.
so many things that I've been reading in the past couple of weeks have been coaches talking about certainly like the importance of the backup quarterback. And we
Mm,
we might touch on this again a little bit in part three. But there's been quite a few trade moves in the last week, specifically around backup quarterbacks with
yeah.
Carson Wentz moving, for example.
Yeah, Carson
So
Wentz, I saw that.
yeah,
And I was
well, we'll,
thinking,
we'll
oh, he's still around.
exactly. Well, we'll touch on that in part three. We'll look at the rest of the news,
Yeah.
but so there's obviously a few injured, but I think most of the teams seem to have come through with a lot of having their um, star players come through the most of preseason unscathed. But
Yeah.
let's obviously we're going to talk about rookies specifically, in part two. But in terms of let's look at some of the actual physical teams now.
Yeah.
Which teams do you think are showing, in your opinion, sort of the most promise? Whether these are the teams who we expect to win, or the teams who you think could be thrown up a few could throw up a few surprises once the season starts, based purely on this preseason nonsense.
Yeah, I think, let's leave the obvious ones, right? The Eagles, the Bills, Ravens and all of that. But I think there's a team that, they looked, well structured. And this is gonna be painful for me to say, but the Giants looked, they look like they've kind of figured some things out. Obviously we've got Abdul Carter, the rookie, and he had flashes, and then of course we saw Jackson Dart doing his thing. It seems like they've got a good defense going into the season. So I think the Giants might surprise a lot of people, right? And I think the 49ers, of course, are going to be more improved. Robert Sala has gone over there, from his time at the Jets. But, people say that he's a better defensive coordinator than he is a head coach, and sometimes we've seen that work well, for some of these coaches. Just look at Dan Quinn. He had to go to Dallas, as a defensive coordinator to get his stock going up because obviously he was the head coach at the time, with the Falcons and the Patriots, them losing that Super Bowl. So his stock fell a little bit, but he's a very good defensive coordinator. And I think that, Robert Sala going to San Francisco 49ers might just be what they need, right, to help them, climb, from where they were last season. So I think the Giants, and the 49ers are teams that I'm going to keep an eye on. Of course, I'm going to keep an eye on the Giants because they're in the same division as the Cowboys. But I think I have officially accepted that the Cowboys are not going to do much this season. So I am quite, happy to watch and see how the Giants, just impress. Um, but I think the Giants will look decent. Broncos, I think, they are going to surprise a few people as well. I think we saw the makings of a very good team and a good quarterback in a system that he's going to be now for a second year in a row. So I fully expect him to look good going into the season. So I think for me, Broncos, Giants, and 49ers were teams that kind of showed me something during the preseason. Not so much in terms of, okay, it's a preseason game, but you're kind of looking for teams to kind of see what's the character of the team. What are they going to look like going into the NFL season? Are they using systems that work? And yeah, I was seeing a lot of things that I like.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest takeaway in a lot of these cases is it's almost the depth, the roster depth that I think that really sort of
Mm,
comes through here. I mean, you mentioned teams are taking this preseason seriously, and which they absolutely should do. But I think in a lot of cases, it's about giving these, giving the rookies some reps,
yeah.
getting their sort of cleats dirty, um, and then it's trying getting the second string, getting the third strings, getting them used to playing. And I think this is where we get to see how deep some of the some of those rosters are. I mean, I think the Giants and their defense, I think, is an interesting one. But again, this is a very sort of cliche thing to say. We just won't know until the season starts. The Giants obviously have missed a couple of defensive players in preseason through injuries, whose names escape me at the moment, but they will be back obviously for the regular season. So let's look at then some of the teams who have maybe sort of disappointed you the most. And again, this is hard to say. And I tell you what, let's get it out of the way. Let's have Cowboys corner now. Welcome to Cowboys corner. Are there any particular teams, as well as the Dallas Cowboys, who you think have been sort of most sort of disappointed with, or have just been a bit meh?
Um, Listen, I mean, the Cowboys, have continued to tell everyone that everything that happens outside of the pitch, of the football pitch, is more important. Cowboys were celebrating, a new documentary that landed on Netflix. And that's all, they were talking about, and if it wasn't that, it was the Micah Parsons, the owner and the GM, basically said, hey, the Cowboys is a soap opera 365 days of the year. And if there is nothing going on, I stir something up. So I mean that kind of tells you, what the Cowboys are thinking of. And in preseason, it's difficult, right? I try to like remove myself, from the performance as a whole, and maybe look at some, spotlight, some players, who I think, might have a chance to make the roster and things like that. But you can just see some of the same problems the Cowboys have had, still rearing themselves, even in the preseason. And I know you might say it's the same kind, it's not going to be the same players, but you just need to be able to stop the run. It's something that the Cowboys, just don't seem to be able to do properly. Have competent play in the quarterback position. Now, I know that, Dak Prescott is going to completely change that, but Joe Milton didn't exactly cover himself, in glory in the preseason games. So the Cowboys have no backup. And we're talking about earlier on about how backups, are quite important, in the league, in terms of, just being able to know that if something were to happen, you can at least patch things up until your starter gets upright again and comes in and play. So Cowboys, for me were very disappointing. Um, I mean, I don't know. I didn't see the Seahawks, and I think to myself, oh, this is the team, that seemed to have got it together, as well. So that was another team that, I mean, I kind of look at the division that they're in, and I fully expect them to be in a full flesh fight, to get out of that, division, as well. A division that has got the Rams, you've got 49ers, as well. So, that's always going to be a tough thing. So yeah, so I mean, those two teams, for me, just look like, not quite sure what's going on. I think overall, I don't want to be too critical about a lot of teams because even when some of the teams didn't play particularly well, they still had some flashes, right? They still had, some things that can make you think, okay, that's interesting. There is potentially that, these teams might have some life, come week one. But I would say that, the teams that you expect to dominate, there was nothing from this preseason that made me think, I don't think they're gonna dominate. I think the status quo might be returned, this season.
Okay, fair enough. Well, I think that was for you, Eddie. That was a very measured uh,
It
Cowboys
was.
Cowboys corner. I mean, it's interesting looking at so the Athletic this week posted sort of their sort of big sort of supercomputer projections
Yeah.
for all 32 teams. I don't know if you saw this, but it had the Cowboys with the projected wins of well eight, sort of
8. Yeah.
7.9 wins,
Yeah.
which I think everyone agreed was just about right. And it's and exactly the same with Miami. As they seem sported a cap. Yeah, projected wins for Miami again, just about right. So the only sort of one of the weakest teams today were, I mean, we talked about the Giants, projected win for the Giants, 5.5. So obviously the view is that those guys are probably going to be sort of bottom of that table. Has there been anything that sort of come up, do you think, in the last couple of days that's changed your initial projections of who will win their divisions? Is there anything that's going to think me, yeah, okay, I maybe have shot myself in the foot a little bit too early there, or
No, no. I mean, I, I, I think the Bengals, right, for me, I mean, we never projected them to win their division, right, because they're in a very, very tough division, but I expected them to do well. but their defense still looks terrible. And again, this is the thing about overreacting to preseason games, but the defense has always been the Achilles heel for the Bengals. The offense we know is 5 star, right? They can score a gazillion amount of points. I mean, last season they were scoring 30 something points and still losing games.
Mhm.
Right. So, that kind of tells you its own story. So I really hope that the defense improves, but I didn't see anything in that preseason game. So for me, I might be pulling them down now. Maybe that second spot is not, confirmed for them, going forward. Um, but I also the Dolphins, your team, I have some concerns, watching the preseason game, especially that final preseason game and the offensive line. And we always have this conversation about Tua, right? Tua needs to be healthy. He needs to stay
Mhm.
upright. And the only way that you protect him is by having good offensive line play.
Correct.
And it didn't look like, they had fixed that. So I am concerned about Tua because when he's upright, you know that he can play. And I'm hoping that he gets good numbers because Tyreek Hill is still there. You've got Jalen Waddle as well. Although HN has got injured, the running back, so I don't know what his status is gonna look like, going into the season. But without a running game, because HN was dynamic, and you don't have offensive line protecting Tua, this might be a long start, of the season, for the Dolphins as well. So, they're
Well,
another
yeah.
team that are making me think about where we kind of put them in the division.
Well, I think with Dolphins, Jets, and Patriots, I think we all said they're all battling for second place and
Yeah,
hoping for a wild card. And I think for Dolphins, you mentioned it. The key thing is staying healthy. I mean, they have a um, huge amount of attacking talent. You've got Tua, Tyreek Hill, H, and you mentioned Chubb, Phillips. They've got some really strong players, but all of the players I've just mentioned have spent a significant amount of time out
yeah,
over recent seasons to some degree or another. And without those guys in, yes, also we've got Waddle, fantastic player, but you can't do that with a weak O line. You can't do that with a weak second string QB. You can't do that. So keeping those guys fit is key. Their schedule is not the hardest. I think it's a
mm,
fairly light schedule. So
yeah,
again, these guys have, the Athletic have predicted them to get 8 wins, which is same as last season. So certainly a sideways season. So I think it just keeping those guys fit is key.
yeah.
Um, okay, look, I tell you what, let's leave that there for part one, where we looked at some of the teams, and in part two we will come back and look at some of the rookies. So we'll be back shortly.
Thank you for tuning to this episode of Across the Gridiron.
So for more NFL related news, insights, and somewhat outlandish Cowboys opinion and rants, please leave a comment or hit like and subscribe. And don't forget to hit that notification button so you never miss a video of any of our nonsense.
And we'll be back soon at Across the Gridiron.
I'm the bad guy. I'm the